Just to mention a few things, the two plays I mentioned by Ben Jonson last time are The Alchemist and Bartholomew Fair. They are the other two great Renaissance plays attacking the Puritans. They're very funny and among the best plays of the period, and you want to see and develop many of the same ideas that Shakespeare does about the Puritans in them. My intention is to finish up fairly quickly on Twelfth Night and actually introduce King Lear today by talking about the issue of the state of nature, a central issue of political thought that we'll be exploring in King Lear. We are on schedule to finish lectures as originally placed at April 28th. I am considering holding an informal session on April 30th. For those of you who want it, that would be a kind of review session, and you could ask questions about the final then, but obviously it wouldn't be required. I'll let you guys think about that, maybe poll people over email, but in any case, we should be finished by April 28th, unless it snows again. Okay, to finish up on Twelfth Night, I'd actually like to begin with one of Shakespeare's sources. It's a work called Apollonius and Scylla by Barnaby Rich. It's in the Signet editions. It's always very interesting to look at Shakespeare's sources. If you ever want to see how great Shakespeare is, compare his sources and see what he was able to do with stuff that looks pretty awful to us. Othello is a particularly good example of that, what he managed to eke out of that story. But if you've got the Signet, this is on pages 110 to 111. This is Rich's introduction to his little love story. There is no child that is born into this wretched world, but before it doth suck the mother's milk, it taketh first a sup of the cup of error, which maketh us, when we come to riper years, not only to enter into actions of injury, but many times to stray from what is right and reason, but in all other things, wherein we show ourselves to be most drunken with this poisoned cup, it is in our actions of love. For the lover is so estranged from that is right, and wandereth so wide from the bounds of reason, that he is not able to deem white from black, good from bad, virtue from vice, but only led by the appetite of his own affections, and grounding them on the foolishness of his own fancies, will so settle his liking on such a one, as either by desert or unworthiness will merit rather to be loathed than loved. Now, in a way, that's a propositional statement of what we've been seeing in Shakespeare's comedies, but the tone is all wrong. That is, we've been seeing that Shakespeare presents Eros as this irrational force, and he shows us the confusions that lovers enter into and the mistakes he makes. But this is a good measure of where Shakespeare stands. This is what Jacques might say about love. This is what Malvolio might say about love. This is an attitude that Shakespeare is careful to distinguish himself from. This is way too bitter for Shakespeare. To have such contempt for love. Shakespeare's satire, his comedy, is always more gentle. It's more accepting of human foibles. It is in the mode of, Lord, what fools these mortals be, with the understanding that he's part of the folly because Shakespeare is also a human being. So Shakespeare was out of sync with his source here. But then Rich says something that may have struck Shakespeare. If a question might be asked, what is the ground indeed of reasonable love, whereby the knot is knit of true and perfect friendship? Now, there's that idea I've been talking about with As You Like It and with Twelfth Night, that love must be thought of as on the model of friendship. I don't think Shakespeare got that idea from Rich, but you can say he might have reinforced it for Shakespeare. What is the ground indeed of reasonable love, whereby the knot is knit of true and perfect friendship? I think those that be wise would answer, desert. That is, where the party beloved doth requite us with the like. That's that reciprocity in love I was talking about in Twelfth Night. For otherwise, and here you'll see, the kind of critique of Petrarchan love that Shakespeare develops. For otherwise, if the bare show of beauty or the comeliness of personage might be sufficient to confirm us in our love, those that be accustomed to go to fairs and markets might sometimes fall in love with 20 in a day. Desert must then be of force the ground of reasonable love. For to love them that hate us, to follow them that fly from us, to fawn on them that frown on us, to curry favor with them that disdain us, to be glad to please them that care not how they offend us, who will not confess this to be an erroneous love, neither grounded upon wit nor reason? I mentioned this so you can see, I've been presenting Shakespeare's critique of Petrarchan love and comparing him to Cervantes. They're not alone in this. There are other people who see the ridiculousness of this idea of the man worshiping a woman from afar and wallowing in her rejection of him. And this emphasis on reasonable love in Rich, again, I think that gives you an idea where the emphasis is in Shakespeare, on a kind of reasonable love. So what we've got here is a story in Twelfth Night that exposes fallacy of a kind of thinking about love. We see in the case of both Olivia and Duke Orsino that they are locked in futile positions. One good measure of it is the fact that their love affair is conducted by intermediaries. We don't know if they've even met, but in any case, they work through messengers going back and forth, not that kind of vital and vibrant exchange that Romeo and Juliet experienced from their first moment of meeting. And there's a sense that, therefore, this love is going nowhere. In Olivia's case, she presents it as a matter of mourning, that she's in mourning for a dead brother. The course of the play indicates to us how shallow those emotions really are. And indeed, Feste the clown points out to her early in the play, page 17, the contradiction in her position. This is Act 1, Scene 5, about line 65. Good Madonna, why mourn'st thou? Good fool, for my brother's death. I think his whole soul is in hell, Madonna. Olivia says, I know his soul is in heaven, fool. And then Feste answers, the more fool Madonna to mourn for your brother's soul being in heaven. It shows, if she were really honest about her beliefs, she shouldn't see this as something terrible for her brother, and above all, to move on. That's what we see here. As I said, this is Shakespeare's test case here in Twelfth Night. Let's remove all the problems we've seen in love, and then we find that in the absence of real problems, lovers create imaginary problems for themselves. We really see the perversity of this brand of love in that it actively seeks out suffering. They want to be miserable. They don't want to be happy. They don't want to live life. They're using love, and in Olivia's case, her mourning, as an excuse for not getting on with the business of life. Above all, we see them locked into these artificial positions, and they will not accept change. I mentioned what you could call emotional inertia here. I think Shakespeare's rather, as always, psychologically astute in seeing this, that people can be attracted to misery because they get comfortable with it. It's almost, you could say, a habit. And what we see here, typical of the characters who won't go along with the comedy, is characters who won't change. Again, the comic virtue is flexibility, and therefore embracing the world of mutability, the world of metamorphosis. Shakespeare was maybe his favorite book was Ovid's Metamorphoses. And Midsummer Night's Dream is riddled with stories out of Ovid's Metamorphoses. It's a rather interesting touch that Malvolio rejects metamorphosis. He's another one of these characters who stands for a kind of rigidity. This is on page 84, Act 4, Scene 2. In the course of a scene, we'll come back to the Inquisition of Malvolio. Feste, disguised as Sertopus, says, this is Act 4, Scene 2, line 51. What is the opinion of Pythagoras concerning wildfowl? And Malvolio correctly answers that the soul of our grandam might happily inherit a bird. This is metempsychosis, the doctrine of Pythagoras, that after death, human beings can go into the souls of animals and so forth. And the clown says, what thinkst thou of his opinion? I think nobly of the soul, and no way approve his opinion. Fare thee well, remain thou in darkness. Thou shalt hold the opinion of Pythagoras, ere I allow thy wits. It's curious, but one of the opinion that Malvolio rejects is the Pythagorean idea of metempsychosis, of mutability, of transformation, of metamorphosis. And so typically in Shakespeare, the comic confusions are introduced to shake people out of the ruts they've gotten into, so that, for example, by falling in love with Cesario, Olivia will experience what it is to be rejected in love. She will experience the pangs of despised love, something poor Orsino has been going through for years, and that she's been unsympathetic to. This is typical what we see in Midsummer Night's Dream and As You Like It. We need these reversals of perspective, these reversals of roles that get people to see what they've been missing in life. And in particular, it's the youth, especially of Viola masquerading as Cesario, that brings this dead world back to life. Shakespeare associates convention and the deadening of conventions with old people. Who knows how much this was a reflection of the Elizabethan court. Elizabeth, during the time Shakespeare was writing, was growing very old. And her counselors were growing very old. And as I've mentioned, it was the young nobles who felt held back by the old men in Elizabeth's court, and people like Essex and Southampton. And Shakespeare may have had an acute feeling for this, the way a political regime can rigidify, become sclerotic, and not be open to the energy of youth anymore. And the comedies seem to deal with that issue of a world of old people clamping down and not accepting youth and change. And so it's, I think, no accident that the heroes and especially the heroines of these romantic comedies are young people, specifically young women, who really shake things up by their willingness to adopt new roles and get things moving, get things changing. And so we get this release of erotic energy. The characters are reordered, they repair as in a dance, and so at the end we're ready to have Sebastian marry Olivia and Duke Orsino to marry Viola. Now Sebastian's case is very interesting in terms of what we've been seeing and the integrative function of comedy, and specifically the role of Eros. Sebastian has the kind of dream experience that we've been looking at in Lovers ever since Romeo and Juliet. He, after all, wanders into a situation that he does not understand. He does not know that his sister Viola has been running around masquerading as a boy, and that people have all sorts of issues with that Cesario. Olivia's fallen in love with him. Andrew Aguecheek is having a fight with him, and Sebastian doesn't know he's got an identical twin sister creating these problems for him. So he has a rather strange time in Illyria. If you look at page 80, so Act 4, Scene 1, line 27, you see the focus of it, are all the people mad? Now, this is that isolation that we've seen so many characters go through, that part of this comic experience is to enter into, it's a mad, 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 mad world where everything's topsy-turvy and things don't seem to be following normal expectations here. And so on page 81, this is Act 4, Scene 1, line 61, he just, now he's had some guy want to have a fight with him and he doesn't know why. And now a woman has shown up who's in love with him and he doesn't know why. That's a little better. Line 60, what relishes in this? How runs the stream? Or I am mad, or else this is a dream. Let fancy still my sense and lead thee steep. If it be thus to dream, still let me sleep. Now we heard Romeo say that his experience with Juliet was like a dream come true. We've seen it in Midsummer Night's Dream, where it happens to all the lovers at the center of the play. Shakespeare continues to associate Eros with this dream world, this world of your dreams, the world of your desires. And it's dreamlike. He wants it, and yet it's very disorienting and unnerving because the world looks mad to him, and he has to wonder if he himself is mad. How does he resolve it? You can see on page 87. So Act 4, Scene 3, what he discovers is he's in a functioning world. And so it can't be just a dream. This is an interesting speech, Act 4, Scene 3, right at the beginning, line 1, as he tries to come to grips with his experience. This is the air, that is the glorious sun, this pearl she gave me, I do feel it and see it. And though 'tis wonder that enwraps me thus, yet 'tis not madness. And then he thinks of Antonio and whether Antonio could help him out. And then line 9, for though my soul disputes well with my sense, that this may be some error, but no madness, yet doth this accident and flood of fortune so far exceed all instance, all discourse, that I am ready to distrust mine eyes, and wrangle with my reason that persuades me to any other trust but that I am mad, or else the lady's mad. It's so crazy what's happening here, especially this beautiful woman, wealthy woman, is in love with him for no apparent reason. He's never met her. He's got to be crazy. But then he thinks it through. Yet if it were so, she could not sway her house, command her followers, take and give back affairs in their dispatch with such a smooth, discreet, and stable bearing as I perceive she does. So what he looks for is a functioning society. If you're mad, everything's mad. But here's a household, it's well run, everybody else thinks they're sane. Everyone thinks she's sane. People follow her orders. This is the way in which society is reassuring to people. Let me put it this way. In this world, objectivity takes the form of intersubjectivity. How do you know it's the real world? Well, all these other people think it's the real world. You think you're having a terribly subjective experience, that you're seeing the world the way nobody else does, but it's reassuring, therefore, to have a functioning society around you that confirms your sense this is the way, this is the real world. I don't know how active your dream life is, but very often in our dreams we realize it's got to be a dream because it's just too crazy. I mean, this is not the way the world operates. And so just what we saw in Midsummer Night's Dream, just when the world seems going crazy, in the middle of Act 3, just when moment when you think you're mad, you long to get back to society. Again, what we've seen from Romeo and Juliet on, this intense erotic experience can become too solipsistic. You're seeking out something intensely private, but it can become too private. So private, it starts to become dreamlike and then nightmarish. And you crave some kind of substantiality to your experience that only comes from experiencing the world with other people. and that's what happens here. It again suggests the function of the comic form. It takes people out of society to let them reorder their affections and maybe get more back in touch with nature. But in Shakespearean comedy, the characters are reordered back into society because that's the only way to give ground and stability to their lives. There's a marvelous prefiguration of this, and As You Like It, you can look it up. It's on page 60, so Act 3, Scene 2, about line 391. When Rosalind says to Orlando, "Love is merely a madness, and I tell you, deserves as well a dark house and a whip as madmen do." That's looking forward, by the way, to Malvolio in Twelfth Night. Love deserves as well a dark house and a whip as madmen do. And the reason why they are not so punished and cured is that the lunacy is so ordinary that the whippers are in love too. That's the only thing that gets us out of the lunacy of love is that all human beings are lunatic when it comes to love. The lunacy is so ordinary that the worshippers are in love too. That's like the joke when they send Hamlet to England because they think he's mad and say they won't notice it there because everybody's mad in England. But what love is a common madness, as Shakespeare presents it. It is irrational. But if it can be integrated into society, it can be made at least somewhat rational and made to be part of a functional society. So we really see in Sebastian's case what's typical Shakespeare's comic figures. They have a crazy, topsy-turvy, irrational experience, and yet it actually brings them into the world of society. He gets to marry Olivia and become part of Illyrian society. And again, that's the comic movement. Now, Shakespeare contrasts that with Malvolio, and that's what I really want to talk about today, mainly about Malvolio. And he is excluded at the end of the play. Indeed, he excludes himself. The famous line on page 103, Act 5, Scene 1, line 380, "I'll be revenged on the whole pack of you." Comic ending, party time, everybody's happy. And Olivia tries to bring him in. Line 371, "Alas, poor fool, how they have baffled thee." She tries to be sympathetic and we understand it was just a joke, but of course she calls him poor fool. And your notes claim that's a term of affection. I don't know about that. When I've been called fool, I haven't taken as much of a term of affection. And actually you see there the point. He can only be reintegrated into society if he accepts the fact that he's been a fool. And he's too proud to do that, as we'll see. Pride is a chief characteristic of him. And to be reintegrated into society at the end of comedy, people have to admit their foolishness, give up their pretensions, admit that they're just ordinary human beings. And for example, they're not Romeo and Juliet. They're not willing to go to the death over their love. They're willing to take second best. And settle for an unheroic position in society. Shakespeare helps to define the inclusive character of comedy by having an exclusion, just as we saw with Jacobs at the end of As You Like It. The comic conclusion is inclusive, but it's never all-inclusive. Shakespeare always shows there's something left hanging there. That element of tragedy that he, of course, develops elsewhere. But if you have this signet, there's a famous essay by Charles Lamb in it. I'll just read you the end of that. It's on page 138. "I confess that I never saw the catastrophe of Malvolio without a kind of tragic interest." Charles Lamb is famous for the idea of Malvolio as a tragic figure. I think that's wrong, but Lamb's onto something there. Shakespeare wants to show you that, yes, in a comedy, everybody has to think the same at the end. Everybody has to see the same world. There's no room anymore for Romeo and Juliet, who see a kind of love that transcends the political community. No, these have to be people who are willing to get married, found families, participate in the city. Now, it's actually very interesting that both at the end of As You Like It and here at the end of Twelfth Night, that Shakespeare does suggest a kind of religious dimension to this exclusion. Remember, Jacques went off with this convertite, with this Duke Frederick, who was going to become a hermit. And of course, as I started saying last time, Malvolio is identified with religion. And again, religion is a powerful aspect of human life that isn't always fully integratable into the political community. We talk about religious fanaticism, for example. By that we mean, people who take their religious beliefs more seriously than their social or political beliefs, or who base their social or political beliefs on their religious beliefs. Shakespeare was confronted with a lot of religious fanaticism in his lifetime. And so, from the start, I've said that the kind of love that Shakespeare explores in his comedies has a link to religion. That this transcendent dimension to medieval courtly love somehow comes from its links to Christianity. And so it's not so strange that in these plays about romantic love, Shakespeare should bring up issues of religion, and in particular show how, at the end of As You Like It, here, Twelfth Night, that people with an extreme religious view of some kind are not going to fit in to the comically refounded community at the end. And I think this is specifically true in the case of Malvolio here. There are interesting little hints in the play that there might be some associations of the characters with religion. If you look at page 37, for example, this is Act 2, Scene 3, about line 155, we hear about this document that's going to fool Malvolio. Maria says, I will drop in his way some obscure epistles of love. Now, epistles is a normal word for letter, but it's also specifically a word for letters in the New Testament, the epistle to the Corinthians, and so on. There are a lot of epistles in the New Testament, and if you think I'm weird for making that connection, look at page 100, where Feste says, this is Act 5, Scene 1, about line 287, Feste says, but as a madman's epistles are no gospels, so it skills not much when they are delivered. Here, the epistles of love are especially directly associated with the gospel. So there's again that weird confluence of this extreme form of love with Christianity. It's something we saw with Bottom in A Midsummer Night's Dream, where he echoed Paul's epistles to the Corinthians in his moment of his dream. So that's why I say there's something going on here. And in the case of Malvolio, we have this very strong fact that he is named as a Puritan in the play. And I've been surprised, I've been checking into it, how much critics are tempted to trivialize this, as your notes do in this edition, to say, well, he's called a Puritan, but it's not really meant in the religious sense. I find that very dubious in the light of plays like Ben Jonson's, in light of the whole issue. And again, we've talked about how heated the religious situation was in Shakespeare's day. I started by talking about the conflict between Catholicism and Protestantism, which dominated the whole 16th century in England, but that was even more heated up by the conflicts within Protestantism between the rather moderate or middle position of Anglicanism and the extreme, more radically Protestant position of Puritanism. The religious establishment in Shakespeare's day, the Church of England, was, as I was talking about last time, threatened on both sides. You had Catholics who were appalled that Henry VIII had broken with the Catholic Church. But then you had the figures called Puritans who were appalled that Henry hadn't broken enough with the Catholic Church, and that he still had an ecclesiastical hierarchy with bishops and archbishops, that he still had a liturgy that looked Catholic, that the churches were still adorned with what to Puritans looked like idolatry. And Henry had tried to craft a Church of England, but all sorts of Protestant developments were going on the continent, and especially John Calvin in Switzerland. That was the form of Protestantism that became very attractive, particularly in Scotland, the Scottish Presbyterians. So again, it's not going to be on the final, but I'm just saying, a very complicated situation. And things in Shakespeare's lifetime, there was still a threat from the Catholic Church. 1589, the Armada, 1605, the Gunpowder Plot, an attempt to blow up the king in Parliament to restore Catholicism to England. This was serious stuff. But you also had these Puritans agitating for a much more radical form of Protestantism, and one of their agitations was against the theater. And again, 1642, what we would call the Puritan forces in Parliament finally did outlaw theater in England, and that survived until 1600 with the Restoration under Charles II. So this was important stuff for Shakespeare, just from a career point of view. And so in portraying Malvolio as the odd man out here, there really is a strong religious dimension to it. That is, what prevents him from participating in the common conclusion is that he fundamentally sees the world differently than the other characters do. He refuses to see the world as they do. And it is presented in at least quasi-religious terms here. Now, what I find particularly fascinating about the play is Shakespeare's sociology of religion here. Centuries before Max Weber, Shakespeare is looking into what Max Weber called the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. That is, what's really interesting is Shakespeare's understanding of Malvolio as a middle-class figure. That is who the Puritans were in terms of the socio-economic lineup. The aristocrats were on the side of the Anglican Church and the Tudor dynasty. The Puritan forces were largely middle class, centered in the city of London. The Puritans were merchants, largely money people. That's how they gained their strength, and eventually were able to stand up to the establishment in England. And Shakespeare does line up the opposition in the play between aristocrats and the middle class Malvolio. Now, you may have felt that Sir Toby Belch is another version of Falstaff. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. This is not a very flattering image of the aristocracy. Again, when Shakespeare gave many, many great portraits of the nobility and heroism of the aristocracy, Hotspur would be a good example of it. I keep pointing out, though, he was no blind admirer of actual aristocracy and knew how degenerate an aristocracy could become. And certainly Toby Belch is no Hotspur. Again, he's more like Falstaff. He does represent many of the things that Falstaff does, a kind of overindulgence. He's a spirit of disorder. Page 8. Act 1, Scene 3, line 7, Maria says, but to him you must confine yourself within the modest limits of order. That's the bourgeois world, the middle class world, the modest limits of order. And Toby says, I'll confine myself no finer than I am. And of course, most fundamentally, he's a drunk. And like Falstaff, he believes in reversing the order of night and day in the world. If you look at page 30, this is Act 2, Scene 3, the very opening approach, Sir Andrew. Not to be at bed after midnight is to be up betimes. You know, the middle-class virtue is get up early in the morning. Toby's solution is don't go to sleep. Drink all night, you'll be up early in the morning. And, you know, that's as virtuous as it gets for him. And Shakespeare celebrates this. Again, that great line, I can't resist quoting it again, page 35, Act 2, Scene 3, line 113, when Toby says to Malvolio, art any more than a steward? Dost thou think because thou art virtuous, there shall be no more cakes and ales? And this Twelfth Night play, Twelfth Night of Christmas, celebrating the festive spirit of Christmas, Shakespeare celebrates the festive spirit of life, as he does in his festive comedies, one starring a guy named Feste, in this case, and he associates it with the aristocracy, the party animals of the Renaissance. And notice how that begins, art any more than a steward. That's the aristocratic contempt there. You're a working man here. Steward is a fairly high position. He's not an ordinary servant. He's running the household. He's responsible for the accounts, a pretty high position, but it still makes him not an aristocrat. And Shakespeare explores here is the psychology of this middle-class character who turns out to be a social climber, who wants to be better than he is in position because he thinks he's better than his betters. One thing Shakespeare dwells on is Malvolio's self-love. It's almost the first thing we hear about on page 18. This is Act 1, Scene 5. Olivia says, this is Act 1, Scene 5, line 90. Olivia says, oh, you were sick of self-love, Malvolio. And this is an important motif in the play. It comes up again on page 36 when Maria, this is the passage where she calls him a Puritan. This is Act 2, Scene 3, line 146. The devil a Puritan that is, or anything constantly but a time pleaser, an affectioned ass that cons state without book and utters it by great swallows, the best persuaded himself so crammed as he thinks with excellencies that it is his grounds of faith that all that look on him love him. There's a very high opinion of himself, and he thinks other people have a high opinion of him. He's a time pleaser. He tries to ingratiate himself with people. He's an affection ass here. Say affected, he's conceited. Constate without book. He pretends to be in on important political subjects when he's not. Now this is all tied together. This is the passage that names him Puritan and speaks of his grounds of faith, and it ties it in with what I'm calling his middle-class characteristics. And again, Shakespeare has this pegged exactly right. Ben Jonson shows the same thing with Tribulation Wholesome in The Alchemist and Zeal of the Land Busy in Bartholomew Fair. The Puritan in Bartholomew Fair is a clothing merchant. And make fun of the fact that he condemns the awful clothing people wear that dress them up in idolatrous fashion. And he's, of course, manufacturing the clothes himself in Ben Jonson's play. But everything runs together in this one passage here. What Shakespeare shows here is the psychology of this kind of man. Now, he is talented. He runs a good household. It's one of the things to realize in reading comedy that our aesthetic sense does not always line up with our moral sense. On the stage, we hoot down characters like Malvolio. He's a killjoy. He's a spoil sport. We want to have fun. We've gone to the theater to have fun. You know, if you lived in Olivia's household, you might like this guy because he's keeping things functioning, and your salary's getting paid because he's pinching pennies and making sure the money's there. But those bourgeois virtues rarely come across well on the stage, and they are often the subject of comedy, making fun of people who are penny pinchers. And you know, we respond to people like Toby Belch, who are spendthrifts, and you know, a round of drinks for everybody. They spread joy rather than killing joy. Shakespeare sees this type. It's funny, one of the Puritans would complain that working people wasted their money going to these plays. That one of the reasons that theaters should be shut down is ordinary people were wasting money on entertainment. Imagine what Shakespeare thought of that opinion when he was making his living off those people wasting money on entertainment. But Malvolio is the sort of guy who would not go to a play, who would, in fact, hoot it down. And he has a very high opinion of himself, in some ways justifiably, that he's running the household. And he sees this drunken aristocrat, Toby Belch, who's worthless, who's spending all the money. How's the household going to go on? And quite frankly, Malvolio thinks he's better than Toby Belch, and he should be able to run things in the household. That is what makes him susceptible to this deception. His high opinion of himself and a secret desire to rule over the household. That makes him believe this preposterous note he finds. And again, Shakespeare is very clear on this, page 44. So Act 2, Scene 5, line 23. What we see Malvolio saying, "'Tis but fortune, all is fortune." That's a very middle-class attitude. What he's saying there is the fact that Toby Belch is an aristocrat, that's just luck. You know, if this were a world of merit, Malvolio would be on top. But in this world, all is fortune. Maria once told me, Olivia did affect me, and I've heard herself come thus near that should she fancy it should be one of my complexion. Besides, she uses me with a more exalted respect than anyone else follows her. What should I think on it? And then it comes out at line 35, to be Count Malvolio. You know, this is a real time-serving pipsqueak. Always obsequious, following orders, but he wants to be Count Malvolio. It's like Bottom wanting to be the tyrant. Shakespeare sees this, that there are a lot of ordinary people out there who have fantasies of greatness. And indeed, line 39, he says, "The lady of the straitjee married the yeoman of the wardrobe." No one has been able to track down what this story is, but evidently it is a story of somebody, some woman who elevated a serving man to a high position by marrying him. And there are several Elizabethan and Jacobean plays that deal with this. John Webster's Duchess of Malfi, for example. You see here the dreams of the bourgeois man. That he could become great. And he's living his fantasy life, page 45. So at line 42, Fabian says, "Look how imagination blows him." And here come the dreams, line 44, Malvolio saying, "Having been 3 months married to her, sitting in my state, calling my officers about me in my branched velvet gown, having come from a daybed where I've left Olivia sleeping, and then to have the humor of state, and after a demure travel of regard, telling them I know my place, as I would they should do theirs, to ask for my kinsman Toby." And that bolts and shackles, Toby says. He can't be related to him. Toby's an aristocrat, not a high-level aristocrat, but an aristocrat, Sir Toby Belch, and Malvolio's just a steward. Now, by the way, Malvolio behaves just like Bottom here. Bottom, when Titania falls in love with him, and he's got all the fairies at his service, Bottom adjusts to it very well. Suddenly he's acting like an Oriental potentate here. And the note is perfectly suited to this whole take on Malvolio. This is page 48, Act 2, Scene 5, line 142. What does the note say? If this falls into thy hands, revolve. In my stars I am above thee, but be not afraid of greatness. Some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them. There could be nothing more calculated to appeal to Malvolio's middle-class aspirations here. Some are born great is the aristocratic principle, but some achieve greatness or some have greatness thrust upon. That's the middle-class principle. Greatness is not a matter of birth. It's a matter of achievement. And we see that so strongly in here with Malvolio over on page 49, line 155 in Act 2, Scene 5. If not, the letter says, if not, let me see thee a steward still, the fellow of servants, and not worthy to touch fortune's fingers. Farewell she that would alter services with thee. And that really brings it out in him. Daylight and champion discovers not more. This is open. I will be proud. I will read politic authors. I do not fool myself to let imagination jade me, for every reason excites to this. Now, again, Shakespeare was not the only person to see this. Ben Jonson suggests something very similar. But he sees a connection between these Puritans and their ostensibly religious hostility to the regime and their actual social aspirations, their social climbing hopes. That is, Malvolio presents himself as a champion of order in this play. He is the steward. He objects to the disorder of Toby Belch and the other aristocrats, but secretly he wishes to overthrow the order more deeply than they do. Because, of course, they've got a stake in the order. They're part of the establishment. Malvolio wants to rule in this world, to be Count Malvolio. And secretly, he's willing to overturn it all here and thinks that he can because of his virtue. He's worthy to be married to his mistress and to become ruler of the world. Now, these Puritans led a revolution in the 1640s. They overthrew the king. They they beheaded King Charles I. They were a tremendous force for disorder. I don't think many people sensed this in 1600. I mean, the Puritans were a problem, and the politicians of the day were dealing with them. It's very interesting that both Ben Jonson and Shakespeare sensed that this Puritanism was a really profound threat to the social order. Again, it's very strong in The Alchemist, that Jonson uses the phrase civil war in that play, or the equivalent of it, civil brawl, or as if he too anticipated there was something revolutionary in these Puritans. And again, you've got a very volatile mix here. You've got a radical religious doctrine which goes root and branch against the established Anglican Church in England, and it's linked up with social forces, the perpetually rising middle class that doesn't like being held down by an aristocracy and wants to be able to take over. Again, the Puritan Revolution failed, but in some ways only temporarily. By the 18th century, the middle class was on its way to ruling England, and the Puritans who were known as dissenters. And again, the term Puritan was a term of opprobrium attached to these people. They had all sorts of other names for themselves: Congregationalists, Brownists, Presbyterians, and so on. But these are the forces which, again, broadly speaking, were known as the Protestant dissenters in England in the 18th and 19th century, and their status gradually grew to the point where they got legitimized in the 19th century. But again, Shakespeare and Johnson see these religious forces linked up with a rising middle class. That's why they're so potent here. Now, what happens, again, very funny, the transformation of Malvolio. He is the great anti-comic figure in the play, but because he's gulled by this note, he starts to act like a comic figure. Page 63, so Act 3, Scene 4, line 10. "No, madam, he does nothing but smile." Again, you have to see him as a grave, taciturn Puritan, almost in the New England Pilgrim mode. Now suddenly the guy's smiling. Page 65, Act 3, Scene 4, line 58. Olivia says, "Why, this is very Midsummer Madness." The other thing is he dresses up idiotically with these yellow garters. And again, just picture our image of the Puritan dressed all in black. There's nothing less comic than someone dressed all in black. Hamlet spoils all the festivities in Denmark by never taking off his clothes of mourning and showing up all dressed in black at a state occasion. In that case, it's a tragedy, and we appreciate it. We're now in the world of comedy where dressing in black is not the thing to do. And so Malvolio is tricked into showing up with these yellow garters and making a fool of himself. Now he keeps emphasizing the uniqueness of his position. Page 67, so Act 3, Scene 4, line 95. "Go off, I discard you, let me enjoy my private." And again, that's the sort of thing that can't be tolerated in comedy. People who go off into the private, who don't participate in the fun, don't participate in the society, they are the butts of comedy. And similarly, page 68, where this is Act 3, Scene 4, line 130, where he says, you are idle, shallow things, I am not of your element." And the typical butt of comedy here, who thinks he's so much more than he is. It's okay if Hamlet says this or if King Lear says this, but it's not okay if Malvolio says it. He's just a middle-class steward. Typical butt of comedy is the man of pretension, who thinks he's great when he is not at all great. And so they now torment him based on his claims to privacy. Page 83, so Act 4, Scene 2, Feste shows up dressed as Sir Topaz, and what does he do? He convinces Malvolio that he is not seeing the world the way other people are seeing it, and therefore he is mad. That's the same experience as Sebastian, but here at torment. This is at page 83, Act 4, Scene 2, about line 35. Feste says, "Sayest thou that house is dark as hell, Sir Topaz? Why, it hath bay windows transparent as barricadoes, and the clerestories towards the south-north are lustrous as ebony, and yet complainest thou of obstruction." This is a bit of nonsense here, but he's basically saying, hey, the light's pouring in. I am not mad, Sir Topaz. I say to you, this house is dark. Madman, thou errest. I say there is no darkness but ignorance, in which thou art more puzzled than the Egyptians in their fog. And so the whole point is to convince him, you think the world's dark, it's really light. Actually, that was Barnaby Rich's language about love, as I recall. That one thing that the crazy lovers do is, they can't tell white from black. And here, Malvolio was told he can't tell white from black. And this is the torment for him. Sebastian, the world looks crazy to him, but it's a good kind of crazy. Woman loves him, that really attractive, wealthy woman is in love with him, and he's able to fit in that world. Here we're presented with Malvolio having this profoundly idiosyncratic vision. Remember Bottom, who had that vision of the fairy queen and could not even speak about it, and said, "I'm no true Athenian if I tell you what happened." And Malvolio is no true Illyrian now. They're convincing him that he is mad by virtue of these strange visions he has. And so that's why he is excluded at the end. And as on page 103, he says, "I'll be revenged on the whole pack of you." Now, many people have seen that, I think quite rightly, as a kind of prediction of the 1640s and the English Civil War. The Malvolio types did have their revenge on the aristocrats. They beheaded the king. They had their revenge on Shakespeare's theater. They shut it down. It's pretty ominous. Now, again, it's a lot to say that Shakespeare anticipates all of this, but it's quite uncanny because he's got the Roundheads against the Cavaliers already. In this play, the middle-class Puritans shaping up against the establishment aristocrats, and there's even a hint, if the king's party is going to consist of Sir Toby Belch and Andrew Aguecheek, they're in trouble when Oliver Cromwell comes along leading the Puritan armies. So I'll just say this is a play that. Again, I offered it to you as the least political of Shakespeare's plays, and it seems so much like a trifle, bagatelle, and yet with the character of Malvolio in it, it becomes very serious politically because I think it's taking up a very serious religious issue of Shakespeare's day, which was very political, because in objecting to the Anglican Church, the Puritans were objecting to the whole Tudor Elizabethan regime. Okay, let me just pull. Any questions about Twelfth Night? Yes.
So then, what about the status of Olivia? She actually seems to be very similar to Malvolio. I mean, she's also brave and untested, except for the fact that she manages to fall in love and seems to then convert.
That's a big exception. That's the whole point of the integrative power of Eros. The question is, what about Olivia? Isn't she sort of Puritan like Malvolio? And in fact, she's presumably dressed in black and as much as Puritan about it at the beginning. But that's the whole point of the comic hijinks in these comedies, to get people like Olivia to loosen up and join the party. And that's what she does at the end. And she's learned to appreciate the youthful good looks and high-spiritedness of this Cesario Sebastian figure. So indeed, what we get is a society that recoalesces in a form that is more liberated. Again, it's not this impasse that we have at the beginning. And she was willing to embrace Malvolio and fit him in. Now again, you see a nice point. Malvolio is the man of principle here. He sticks to his guns. He has a kind of integrity. That's the kind of character that can't stay in a comedy. But Olivia has a flexibility and will adapt. And notice again, the point is, she wasn't in love with anyone except her dead brother at the beginning of the play. But she's willing to take this Cesario Sebastian figure to have some fun in life and participate in it. She's willing to change, and Malvolio is not. In fact, his change is totally phony. I mean, he would be happy to change into Count Malvolio. So offered that prospect, he doesn't. But it's, of course, a phony transformation and unsustainable because it rests on an illusion that Olivia actually loves him. So again, we see in this play the comic principle, which is the people who are resistant to change must be excluded. The people who have a high sense of themselves and their integrity must be excluded. And the people that survive for the comic ending are the ones who can make the adjustments and settle for second best. It is interesting if you contrast what I've been doing here, love as a motive and religion as a motive. Love, generally speaking, is more willing to admit compromise than religion is. You could talk about, we've talked about the religion of love and conversion in the religion of love. It's easier to convert from Hermia to Helena than it is to convert from Catholicism to Protestantism. Love is serious business, and Shakespeare's certainly aware of it. But, it may be not all that serious, and Shakespeare shows what is so true of human nature. That Eros, which ultimately is seeking pleasure and happiness, is willing to settle for second best, is willing to make conversions. Okay, it's not working out with Hermia. I'm going to die if I continue with this. Okay, I'll settle for Helena. That's very different than saying, okay, the Catholicism's a bit of a problem. I'll go with Protestantism. Now, there are people who do that. Henry IV of France. Paris is worth a mass, as he famously said, converting from Protestantism to Catholicism. But that was very political. And, I think Shakespeare is aware that religion's a more serious issue than love. Although what he is showing in these plays, is how they have gotten blended together and how problematic love can become when it takes on the status of a religion. That's what happens with Romeo and Juliet and what makes their story tragedy. Okay, I'm going to give you an introduction now to King Lear and I want to give a lot of time to that play. And, this course is a course in Shakespeare's political thought, and that's enough to learn. But I have been trying to bring in other moments in political thought. We've talked about Machiavelli. We've talked about Plato and Aristotle. Let me talk a little bit about Hobbes and Rousseau now. I mean, this is just ridiculous what I'm doing. I'm going to try to give you a lecture on Hobbes and Locke and state of nature in a couple of minutes here, and even more if I get to it. But I'm setting this up. We're going to be approaching King Lear in terms of the issue of the state of nature. And I want you to be thinking about this as you read the play. We have already been exploring this issue. I've been saying that for Shakespeare, the state of nature is civilization. That is one thing we see in these comedies, is that the true home of humanity is in civilization, that you can go off into nature to reorder and maybe rejuvenate your desires, but you have to come back to civilization in Shakespeare's sense. And this, I think, he's very close to Aristotle. We fulfill ourselves as human beings in civilization, which means our home is civilization. Our nature is manifested in civilization. Now, this view was to be challenged shortly after Shakespeare by Thomas Hobbes in 1651 in his book Leviathan. This is strictly speaking, the beginning of what's called state of nature, thinking and political thought. Actually, as I'll show, Plato and Aristotle had a notion of the state of nature. It was just different, that the state of nature was the city or civilization. But in any case, just quickly, this is the famous chapter 13 of Hobbes's Leviathan, where he argues that the natural state of human beings, the state of nature, is one of perpetual war. And therefore, we can't stay in it. We can't stay in the state of nature. We have to create the Leviathan state. We have to erect this state power, the Leviathan, to rule over our lives and bring order, because otherwise we would just kill each other. It's arguable that Machiavelli is well on the way to Hobbes's notion here, Machiavelli, where the state of war seems to be more basic than the state of peace. But it's really first articulated in the terms of the state of nature in Hobbes's Leviathan. And Hobbes's argument, it starts from the premise that no one human being is so manifestly superior to another that another human being can't kill him, or a combination of other human beings can't kill him. So nobody's safe in the state of nature, and Hobbes argues there are a number of factors that lead people into competition to the death in the state of nature. One of them is they all want the same things, and so they kill each other to have these things. The other is the preemptive strike principle. Because anybody could kill you at any time, you have to strike first. That's a very Machiavellian idea. And finally is Hobbes's reinterpretation of thumos, that Hobbes sees thumos as a purely destructive force, that this desire to be great leads to war. As he puts it, every man looketh that his companion shall value him at the same rate he sets upon himself, and upon all signs of contempt or undervaluing, naturally endeavors, as far as he dares, to extort a greater value from his condemners. This is what Hegel was later to develop into the idea of the struggle for recognition between the master and the slave. But already in Hobbes's ideas, for the sake of honor, people will fight to the death. I'm the best, I'm the greatest. If you don't bow down to me, let's fight it out. The result is Hobbes's famous line about the state of nature, that it's solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, or it's the war of all against all. Now, this is a very revolutionary principle in the history of political philosophy, because it's denying the natural sociability of human beings. It's very much a principle of Plato and especially of Aristotle. It's very important to Hobbes. By the way, in 1651, that's 2 years after the execution of Charles I, very much grows out of Hobbes' experience of the English Civil War, which looked horrible to him, and the destruction of all civilization. And he comes up with the idea we need a civil authority that is absolute to settle all disputes, no matter which way, because it's more important to have disputes settled than that they be settled justly in some abstract sense of justice. And so again, he comes up with the idea of the absolute sovereign, the doctrine of the Leviathan, and he outright says, again in this famous chapter 13 of the Leviathan, that nature should thus dissociate and render men apt to invade and destroy each other. That's nature. It's natural for men to invade and destroy each other. And it will happen, for one thing, because of thumos. One of the reasons is that people will fight to the death for trifles, as a word, a smile, a different opinion, and any other sign of undervalues. Just think of the scene between Glendower and Hotspur in that sense. Now, there's a whole history of this doctrine in this ridiculously quick romp. I'm going to skip over John Locke, who's tremendously important, but we don't need him for the minute, and go directly to Jean-Jacques Rousseau here and his treatment of the state of nature in his second discourse, or the so-called discourse on inequality. Now, Rousseau quarrels with Hobbes's characterization of the state of nature. He argues that Hobbes had never seen the state of nature, that in fact he mistook a civilized state for the state of nature in this notion that people would fight to the death over prestige. Rousseau says that's vanity, and you wouldn't find it in the state of nature. This concern for prestige, this vanity, is only the product of civil society, not of the state of nature. And indeed, Rousseau really probes this idea of state of nature and says if people weren't in a community, they would be more profoundly isolated than we ever see them. And indeed, he said, in a world where basically these natural beings are wandering lonely in the forest, how can they even have vanity? How can they compare themselves with others when they're never even seeing others? So Rousseau argues very strongly for the peacefulness of the state of nature and says it's only in society that we develop this vanity. And Rousseau goes even more radical. And he says, in fact, if we really were solitary in the state of nature, we wouldn't even have speech and reason. That those two are developed only in society. And he argues with Hobbes that in Hobbes, people get together and reason their way out of the state of nature. They come up with a social contract. And Rousseau says, if they're really in the state of nature, you're saying, and Hobbes talks about, there's no civilization, there's no letters, he says, there's no ability to develop all these things we consider our higher culture. Rousseau says, so there's not even language. And he, in the second discourse, speculates that orangutans may in fact be human beings. This is just around the time in the middle of the 18th century when Europeans were discovering orangutans, and if you've ever seen the relevant Clint Eastwood movies, they really are very human looking, of all the great apes. And people speculated maybe these are natural beings. This is what human beings look like. Orangutan means man of the forest in whatever language it is. I think it's Malay. But anyway, there's a famous footnote J in the second discourse which discusses how we might determine if orangutans are human beings. But no one took Rousseau up on the offer. In any case, Rousseau really sees natural man as subhuman in any modern sense. So far more radical than Hobbes. Now, as you read King Lear, you're going to see the Hobbes and the Rousseau proposals. That is the question of whether what we are by nature and whether we are just animals. Is man no more than this? King Lear will ask in Act 3, Scene 4. And it's quite amazing that in 1607 or so, Shakespeare is already looking forward, as we'll see, to these Hobbesian and Lockean answers, Hobbesian and Rousseauian answers. Now, I don't want to spoil things here. I'm going to suggest, though, in our work through King Lear, that in fact what I've been suggesting thus far, that Shakespeare does not accept this view of human nature, though he's willing to explore it and see what its consequences might be. That in this regard, he's much closer to Aristotle and the notion that man is a political animal. Now that comes from Book 1 of Aristotle's Politics. As I've said before, we tend to misinterpret that statement to mean that we're just all very political, contentious beings. In the original Greek, it says that man is that being who by nature lives in the city, in the polis. And this is in line with Aristotle's notion that you define a thing by its perfection, or as he puts it, that which, this is from Politics 1, that which each thing is, when its growth is completed, we speak of as being the nature of each thing. You see that Hobbes, and especially Rousseau, were looking for a sort of lowest common denominator definition of humanity. Rousseau basically says it, what's the least you can see and still call it a human being? He speculates that it's some form of freedom and then decides the lowest thing, that it's perfectibility. In fact, it's impossible to define human nature for Rousseau. We can only say man is that peculiar being who can develop into something better than he was originally. But in any case, it is, if you're considering whether orangutans are human beings, you're really looking for the lowest common denominator. Aristotle would say, you want to see what a human being is like, look at Socrates. Look at the fullest, highest development of a human being. And so the whole discussion of the political community in Book One of the Politics deals with what the city aims at and how human nature flourishes or develops in the city. So that Aristotle points to speech as that characteristic of human beings. This is all in Politics, Book One, that tells us we are, as it were, designed to live in cities. None of the other animals have speech. They can make sounds that express pain and pleasure, but above all, he says they can't debate about what's just, what's right and wrong. And that's what we human beings are. So speech is natural. Contrary to Rousseau, for Aristotle, speech is natural to human beings. And that gives us this peculiar characteristic. Now, think about it. Many people debate this, but there are many people who would say that speech is natural to human beings, but not a particular speech or language. Yes, it's natural that we speak, and all human beings that we know of speak. So that, as Aristotle points out, if we saw a being that couldn't speak, it might look like a human being, but we would really wonder if that was a human being, if it couldn't speak. So closely do we associate speech with human being. But whether it speaks English or Mandarin or French or German, that we don't set limits. We don't say only people who speak English are human. It's a very peculiar characteristic of human beings that speech is natural to us, but a given speech is not. Now again, we now talk about the language of bees and things like that, but those are species specific. And then again, they found that whales from different pods actually communicate in different ways, but Aristotle didn't know that. But basically our notion is, to the extent animals communicate, it's with some kind of instinctual endowment that makes it species characteristic. Think of bird calls. Human beings don't have a natural repertory of communication. Now this is speech, this is what's peculiar. There's this element of nature to it, but also an element of convention to it. The fact of speech seems natural to human beings. What you speak is a matter of convention. So that, lo and behold, a child that grows up in France speaks French. A child that grows up in England speaks English. It's utterly conventional, and yet children everywhere develop languages. So you could put Aristotle's point this way: man is that strange animal whose nature it is to produce conventions. It makes us very peculiar and unique among all the other animals we know. Although we study porpoises and whales, we may find out something different here. Now this creates the great complex question of nature versus convention. We've been examining this. From the very beginning of this course, we saw this issue: king by convention, king by nature. There can be a disparity there. The person who's king by nature, by convention, may not have a kingly nature. Very important question. What's the relation of the nature, the kingly nature, to the position of king? We've been seeing this now in love. Again, a strange mixture of nature and convention. There's something natural about Eros and the copulation of cattle, as Touchstone puts it, that there's something natural about this, something universal, seen in all human beings. It's part of their being part of nature, that they copulate, and that this produces more human beings, what's lead to generation for future generations. But there's this strong element of convention in the relation between men and women. It can't occur without language. It can't occur without words. It's just running in the forest if it's without words, if it's without poetry. It's Touchstone and Audrey. If you want Orlando and Rosalind, you're going to have something of that artificiality we see in Phoebe and Sylvius. And we saw the whole problem of love is conventions can get out of touch with nature. You can have some notion of love conventions that are just unnatural in the sense that they're sterile and unproductive. If a convention of love, like Petrarchan love, gets in the way of human fruition and fecundity, there's something wrong with it in Shakespeare, and he's trying to adjust these conventions to make them more natural. It's a very complicated issue, and again, we'll be exploring in King Lear. Let me introduce the Greek words here to help us understand this a little more. The Greek word for nature is physis, and the Greek word for convention is nomos. Now, nomos is the Greek word for law. It's also a word for customs, for mores, for the way people live. It's related to the word for money. We see it in words like astronomy and agronomy and autonomy. That nami at the end is from Greek nomos. Physis comes from the Greek word futon, which is not a word for an impossibly uncomfortable fold-out bed, but is the Greek word for plant. And the notion of physis is things that grow. The Greek understanding of nature is things that generate by themselves, that are their own principle of coming into being. The most fundamental example of that is plants, but it's true of animals too, which generate themselves. Nomos is things that human beings make, like laws. We make laws just the way we make tables and chairs. The principle of physis is shoes don't grow on trees. Apples grow on trees, that's physis, that's nature. Shoes are things we make that don't grow on trees. Now, this really was the founding of philosophy among the ancient Greeks, to make this distinction between nomos and physis. The first place the word physos appears that we can see is in Homer's Odyssey. First appearance of a word meaning nature anywhere in the world. There is no word in the Hebrew Old Testament that corresponds to physis. There are terms like heaven and earth that refer to what we call the natural world, but they do not have the sense that this word physis does, because physis is what exists without will. And in the Old Testament, everything exists by the will of God. The Greek perception here was that there are things in the world that exist by nature, without human intervention, without even divine intervention. Before this distinction was made, you had something like the Chinese notion of the Tao, the way, that the stars have their way, kings have their way, dogs have their way, bees have their way, the English have their way, things have their ways, and everything is somehow determined by a will. There's a very deep and profound moment when these Greek philosophers in what is now the west coast of Turkey, but was then part of the Greek-speaking world, Ionia, these are people like Xenophanes and Thales, who first started making this division. But at first, it does juxtapose physis with nomos. That is, the things that exist by nature are fundamentally different from anything that exists by human will, which includes the laws. Now, the famous Socratic turn in philosophy that leads to Plato and Aristotle is the turn towards political philosophy. These earlier, we call them pre-Socratics, were not political philosophers because they saw the realm of politics as purely the realm of nomos and entirely different from the world of physis. The great question that Socrates raised was the question of natural right, whether there are any things in the political realm that exist by nature. So that, for example, one could say that one constitution, one form of government was more natural than another. And the great question in Plato and Aristotle is, what is the best regime? And can one say of a law that one is more natural than another, by which one would mean Is the law somehow more suited to human nature than another law? Now, this is the great question we're going to see Shakespeare examining in King Lear. This is the play that looks at the relation most deeply in Shakespeare of politics to nature. The word nature appears more in King Lear than in any other Shakespeare play. I think it's something like 44 times. And you will see many different notions of nature, definitions of nature offered in it. It's very complex. It's going to take us 3 classes at least to sort it out. But this is what we're going to be looking at in King Lear and how it contributes to, in some ways, the central debate of political philosophy. What is the state of nature? Is it something antithetical to society, or is it in fact society? Is the state of nature civilization, or is the state of nature the antithesis to civilization? What's the relation of phusis to nomos, of nomos to phusis? Is all politics just arbitrary? Is it all merely conventional, or can we point to something in the nature of human beings that tells us something about the nature of politics? These are huge questions. I've introduced them way too fast, but I want you to be thinking about this as we get to King Lear, because these are the questions that play probes most deeply.